I built my life on concrete and truth. My daughter's fiancé, Blake Holland, built his on lies and stolen trust. He called my community European peasantry and forced my lawyer daughter to sign documents that would make her legally responsible for his $2.3 million Ponzi scheme that targeted the very immigrants who helped me build my company. This isn't just a family betrayal story, it's a reckoning. My name is Victor Sterling, and I'm the immigrant contractor they dismissed. By the end of this family revenge story, Blake Holland will learn the difference between inherited privilege and earned power, and he'll learn it in front of 150 guests and 2 FBI agents. If you believe in karma like this video, and follow the channel to see how I brought justice to my community. I walked away and picked up my phone. The first name I dialed wasn't my lawyer. It was old Marco. He deserved to hear the truth from me, and I needed to know firsthand exactly how deep Blake Holland's greed had cut into our community. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach, the kind of dread that goes deeper than financial loss. It was the crushing weight of knowing your greatest success. My daughter was about to be ruined by a rot you failed to detect. My daughter Elena. My world. She was marrying Blake Holland in 2 weeks. Blake, Yale graduate, handsome, with the polished arrogance of a man who'd never had to break a sweat. He represented 4 generations of old money. But I suspected the house was empty, and I was right. I remember looking at his perfect profile at dinner thinking, the house may be old, but the mortgage is new, and I bet he's hiding the paperwork. I just didn't realize the paper he was hiding was federal fraud. When I got off the phone with Blake Holland, my hand was shaking. Not from anger, but from a deeper pain. The truth is that boys' words, European peasantry, they didn't just insult my friends, they questioned the entire life I had sacrificed to build. I looked around my home in Greenwich, the marble floors, the cathedral ceilings, the view of the Sound. I hadn't inherited a dime. I'd laid every stone myself, paid for every inch of land with cement dust and calloused hands. I often thought about the difference between Blake's hands and mine. His were soft, meant only for signing documents and shaking hands. Mine were scarred, bearing the permanent record of every load-bearing wall, every mistake, every success. My hands were my biography. His were a blank page. I walked to my office and stopped at a small, unassuming plaque hanging on the wall. It wasn't one of the awards from the governor or the city council. It was an old chipped piece of faded oak wood. It read Dalmatia Masonry, 1995. That was the original name of Sterling & Co. Named for my coast in Croatia. It was my anchor. My connection to the woman I lost. My wife, Katerina. She died 5 years ago, right after Elena graduated law school. She was the one who encouraged me to keep that plaque. Never forget the mortar that holds you together, Vic, she'd told me. That plaque represented everything honest, everything hard-won. I remembered the day I hammered it into the wall of my first rented office, the smell of fresh lumber and hope. It was a promise to Katerina and to myself that our hard work would be respected. How could I let Blake Holland, a boy who'd never lifted anything heavier than a champagne glass, erase that promise? The disrespect had been accumulating for months like cheap water damage that hides behind a fresh coat of paint. In April, Blake insisted Elena and I attend a gala. It's important you start networking with our circles, Vic. You need to smooth out the rough edges. He handed me a tailor's card. I looked at the card, a bespoke tailor in London, and thought, he's not asking me to buy a suit, he's asking me to buy a disguise. Then came the seating chart. Elena, my only child, seated with Blake at the head table flanked by judges and senators. And me, I was positioned at table 14 next to the service entrance of the venue with extended family, written in parentheses. The embarrassment was subtle, designed to make me feel small without giving me a specific reason to lash out. I was the financial source, but the social liability. The final slap was the implication that my presence was a structural flaw in their perfect social building. The deepest pain, however, was Elena's silence. I went upstairs and found her in her childhood room surrounded by piles of wedding magazines. She was a brilliant lawyer working at a prestigious firm in Manhattan. She could argue a complex corporate case to a jury, but she couldn't argue with her arrogant fiancé. "Dad, about the guest list." She started, her voice a fragile thing. "I know it's bad, but Mother Holland says the senator is very particular about the guest registry. It's not personal, it's political." "Did he use the word peasantry on the phone, Elena?" She looked away. "He said they wouldn't understand the decorum, that they don't speak the same language as the Hollands. He said my firm expects me to elevate my profile. I'm trying to fit in, Dad. This could be big for my career. It's just an adjustment, not an insult," she insisted, trying to convince herself more than me. "Love doesn't ask you to be ashamed of the hands that raised you, sweetheart," I countered. "It celebrates your history. When I laid bricks on that first duplex in Astoria, I did it so you wouldn't have to. I did it so you could stand tall, not bend low to fit their world. You're sacrificing your dignity for a title. You are allowing a weak man to define your worth. You don't understand the pressure, Dad. The Hollands are connected. Blake's father practically guaranteed my partnership track if I focused on the right optics. This is how the real world works. They hold the keys to the city, Dad." The real world. She was trading her identity for a marble floor. The final sickening blow came the next morning. Blake arrived unannounced, his confidence somehow boosted by the previous night's confrontation. He held a small checkbook. "Vic, the wedding costs are ballooning. I need another $50,000 for the floral arrangements alone. Since you canceled those 70 invitations, you saved a small fortune. I was thinking you could liquidate some of your sentimental assets." He pointed straight at the Dalmatia masonry plaque. "That old thing," he chuckled. "It's taking up wall space. I found a decent antique dealer who'd give you $5,000 for the lumber. A good metaphor, really. Time to trade the past for the future, Vic. You're holding on to the dust of Queens when you should be reaching for Greenwich. You need to sell the symbol of your humble start, Vic, to afford the luxury of my family's acceptance." That plaque was my wife's last wish. It was the memory of every sleepless night, every scraped knuckle, every dollar earned. And he was asking me to sell my soul for his flowers. The memory of Katerina's hands, rough from her early job in the garment district, yet soft, when they held mine, flashed through my mind. This was a man trying to dismantle my history piece by piece. I didn't yell, I didn't defend. I just nodded, a calm, chilling stillness coming over me. "You're right, Blake. It is time to trade the past for the future." I knew then I wasn't just saving Elena from an arrogant fool. I was saving her from a deeper, more structural kind of corruption. I had to know the truth. I closed my office door and made the call to old Marco. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight, lacking the usual robust Croatian greeting. "Vic, my friend, mi smo graditelji, we are the builders." I began using our old phrase. "Vic," he interrupted, his voice heavy with a shame, deeper than any financial error. "I know why you called. It's about Blake Holland. You heard the rumors, yes, about the Heritage Fund." I heard his words, Marco. He called our people European peasantry and demanded I remove the names of every man and woman who helped me build this company. Now tell me the truth about his fund. Did our community invest heavily? A long, agonizing silence stretched across the line. I was the first, Vic. I brought in 5 other families. He took my late wife's pension, Vic. $150, $1,000. He called it an investment in our community's future. He said it was a chance to finally elevate ourselves above the stigma of immigrant money. We were fooled by his suit and his manners, Vic. We gave him everything. I feel like I robbed my own neighbors on his behalf. Marco's confession was a physical blow. Blake wasn't just gambling. He was running a sophisticated, targeted scam. a Ponzi scheme designed to prey on the trust of my community, the very people he had dismissed. This wasn't just greed. It was malice, targeted at heritage. I thought about the sheer number of trusting working hands Blake's polished fingers had reached into. I realized I couldn't trust my initial private investigator. This required a structural analysis, not just a background check. I called Ante Novak, a man who now specialized in forensic accounting after serving with the Croatian Ministry of Justice. Ante owed me nothing, but he respected the code of the builder. Ante, I need to know the structural integrity of Blake Holland's fund. I need to see the wire transfers. Where the money went after it left Marco's pocket. By Friday morning, Ante had his results. They were worse than I imagined. The money wasn't being used for high-risk investments. It was being used to pay out early investors, the classic Ponzi structure. But the real money was being funneled into a desperate hole. Vic, look at these dates, Ante explained over a secure line. The biggest withdrawals coincided exactly with the Holland family's $200,000 wedding deposits. He didn't just need capital, he needed clean capital for the wedding expenses to maintain the image. He's using your community's retirement savings as a slush fund for his family's facade. Your people's money is paying for their flowers and caviar. I stared at the paperwork, specifically a transfer of $40,000 flagged as wedding vendor retainer. My own community's hard-earned money was paying for Blake's custom-made tux and Elena's lavish floral arrangements. The sickness in my stomach doubled. This was not the simple greed of a gambler. This was the calculated malice of a social predator who targeted the weak while lecturing the successful. I felt the overwhelming obligation of a father not just to his child, but to his entire heritage. He thought he was marrying into money to save his life, I muttered. But he was actually using our wedding as the grand finale of his scam. Marco came to my office that Friday afternoon. He sat across from my desk, not in a suit, but in the familiar denim shirt and work boots of a man who still got his hands dirty. He wasn't just a victim. He was my first backer. I should have known. Vic Marco choked out tears in his eyes. He talked about preserving the Holland legacy, how our money would finally be managed by real American pedigree. He made me feel important, like my savings finally meant something. Marco, he used your trust? That's all he ever had, I said, sliding the forensic report across the desk. It showed Marco's $150,000 being used to pay Blake's personal expenses and the wedding flower deposit. Marco didn't look at the document. He looked at the plaque. Katarina told me you kept that. She was a good woman. He wanted me to sell it, Marco, to pay for the marble floor he thinks he deserves. He wanted me to trade my pride for his vanity. I spent the next hour reviewing the full list of victims. Ante had compiled 14 families, all Croatian, most elderly, several running small family businesses that had been liquidated for Blake's scheme. The Ponzi anchor wasn't Blake's family name. It was the financial desperation of my community. See this name? Vic Marco pointed to the list. Maria Kovac. Her husband died last year. She took $80,000 from her insurance to renovate her home, and Blake convinced her to invest it for 6 months, promising her the new kitchen she needed. She trusted him because he went to Yale. She believed the American dream protected people like him. Blake's cruelty wasn't reckless. It was calculated. He specifically targeted the people whose trust was built on community and who were least likely to report to the federal authorities for fear of disrupting their immigration status or drawing attention to their small finances. The irony was crushing. Blake, the man railing against my immigrant friends, was surviving entirely on the money stolen from them. He was a parasite feeding on the very peasantry he despised. I called Elena to my office later that evening. She arrived straight from her Manhattan firm looking immaculate but exhausted. "Dad, what is this?" she asked, gesturing at the stacks of financial reports. "I've seen the news about the Connecticut fund collapses, but this can't be Blake. This is your fiancé, Elena. He's not an investment banker. He's a con man running a Ponzi scheme, and your wedding is his exit strategy. I showed her the transfer history from Marco Maria and the others. She grew paler with every page. He needed my money to look solvent, Elena. He needed the Holland name to look legitimate. He needed your wedding to look like a successful merger so he could continue the scam until he made his escape. She sank into the chair, the gravity of the betrayal hitting her. He never loved me, did he? He only loved the veneer of security the sterling name could provide. All that talk about optics was just projection. He was the one hiding the dirtiest secret of all. He wanted the marble floor honey. He didn't want the mortar that held the house together. I watched my brilliant, sheltered daughter finally see the true nature of the man she was about to marry. But the biggest betrayal, the most structural flaw in their relationship, was yet to be revealed. I needed to see her face when she learned she wasn't just a victim, but a legal vulnerability. Elena, you said you were drafting an NDA for Blake's private transactions? Where is that agreement now? Because Auntie found something far more concerning attached to those documents. It looks like Blake didn't just need your signature for an NDA. He needed it for something that could put both of us on the wrong side of a federal courthouse. Той се тиеп тук viet pan trina dance quakich bantap trung val vieks tiet lochi tiet ve Ponzi Scheme vali do vik quiet jin jan sapba truko tronke huach to chuk jam koi kua Blake jam bao jat muk tu junk am kit. Fan 3 Porsteend. 10. The Ponzi Blueprint, the Wedding Slush Fund. I knew then I wasn't dealing with simple arrogance or common infidelity. I was dealing with a structural criminal, and I was holding his blueprints. I closed the door on Elena and returned to my conference table where Ante Novak, the forensic accountant, was laying out his final analysis. The data confirmed the Ponzi scheme was not merely opportunistic. It was a systematic raid on the life savings of vulnerable people masked by the old money veneer. Vic, the total misappropriation is closer to $2.5 million. Ante confirmed tapping a screen displaying a complex flowchart. But look at this pattern. Blake's initial seed money dried up 6 months ago. Since then, almost every major withdrawal, $40,000 here for the flowers, $60,000 there for the custom tuxes, and the high-end caterer was funded directly by the new capital from your community. The wedding wasn't happening because of the Holland money. It was happening because of the Croatian money. I felt a cold rage. Blake wasn't just a parasite. He was a cannibal, feeding on the very community he looked down upon. The $200,000 wedding budget, which was supposed to be a symbol of the Holland's enduring wealth, was nothing more than a front, a magnificent scaffold built with stolen working-class funds. I looked at the case file for Maria Kovac. Her husband had died of lung cancer a year earlier, a simple man who worked 40 years in a machine shop. Maria took the life insurance money, $80,000 in planning, to finally install an accessible bathroom and a ramp small dignity for her old age. Blake convinced her to invest it for a high return, saying, "The Hollands will manage your future." Maria, heartbroken and trusting, signed over the money. When she called Blake 6 months later, needing to start construction, he used Elena's NDA, the one she drafted, to silence her threatening legal action for breaking confidentiality. That was the moral line. He didn't just steal the money, he stole the dignity of her final years and used my daughter's legal expertise as the weapon. I pushed the financial reports aside. Auntie, forget the transfers for a moment. I need the Achilles heel of his entire setup. The 3 locations, the Maritime Museum, St. Jude's Church, and the Holland estate. Auntie, understanding my shift from finance to construction, pulled up the property records. The museum is the biggest liability. Sterling and Commerce did a major dock repair, but the final sign-off for the new East Wing HVAC integration, the system needed to handle 150 guests, is still pending your brother-in-law's inspection. If that sign-off is revoked or delayed, the venue is uninsurable. And the church I asked? St. Jude's is a historical landmark. You rebuilt the bell tower support structure 3 years ago. The contract states that Sterling and Cowers retains the right to order an immediate closure for any event that could jeopardize the historical structure based on your certified structural report. Ringing the heavy bells for a full ceremony falls into that clause. I leaned back, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. He chose buildings I owned the structural secrets to. He chose my turf for his final act of fraud. And the estate? The Holland estate is ancient. They did a renovation in 2023, but they cheaped out on the septic upgrade. If they host a massive wedding there, they'll violate the new 2024 municipal code for large gatherings. It's a public health hazard violation, Vic. You just need the right enforcement officer to look at the paperwork. I stood up. I saw the entire Holland facade for what it was, a magnificent house built without a foundation. Blake thought he was marrying into a high society where rules didn't apply. He was wrong. Rules are just codes, and I was the man who wrote and enforced the building code for half of Westchester. Ante, thank you. You've given me the blueprint for demolition. He wants to sell my past to fund his future. I'm going to collapse his present. I reached for my phone, my calm smile returning. The first name I dialed wasn't the police. It was a familiar contact at the municipal code office. The demolition permit was about to be issued not with dynamite, but with precise legal leverage. This was no longer just about getting my daughter out. It was about tearing down the structure of deception that had robbed my friends. Mismo graditeli ante, I said quietly. We build things right, and we tear down things that are built on lies. Toi se tieptuk viet pankardens kua kichpentap trung vau viextietlo de garantor livasutin, ngo jaikiandu kua elena jambao jat muktu jankam kit. Fan 410. The NDA trap and the guarantor lie extended focus. The color drained from Elena's face. When I told her that Auntie had found something far more concerning than the NDA, the color drained from her face, leaving her professional makeup stark against her fear. As a corporate lawyer, she didn't fear the threat of social ruin. She feared the crushing, cold finality of a legal trap. She understood the terror inherent in being on the wrong side of a signed document. The NDA? I drafted it last month, she whispered, her voice raw and laced with self-reproach. He said it was to protect the Holland family's sensitive client list from his father's rivals. I used my firm's template. It was just a standard non-disclosure agreement. I barely looked at the schedules. He said it was routine data formality for future business. I should have known better. I was too busy picking out linens to read the fine print. Blake Holland doesn't do standard Elena. He does structural fraud. His entire life is a series of structural lies. I slid the final document Auntie had forwarded across the desk, the full prospectus for Blake's Heritage Fund. Attached to the back, hidden behind pages of dense financial jargon, was a separate binding contract titled Guarantor Agreement, and her name was on it, bolded and notarized, sitting on the line labeled Elena Sterling-esque. Did you ever sign any other documents for him? Elena. Something titled Commitment to Capital or Personal Guarantee. Her eyes scanned the signature line of the guarantor agreement. She didn't have to answer. Her hand flew to her mouth, gripping the sleeve of her expensive suit, trembling violently. The moment of realization was physically painful to watch, a sudden, complete shattering of reality. A few weeks ago, Dad, he brought papers to my office right before a major client meeting. Said they were standard compliance forms needed before he officially added me to his fund's board post-wedding. He rushed me, Dad. He rushed me. Said I was late for a client meeting and his driver was waiting. I didn't read the fine print. I just signed it. I signed it without reading the schedule of liabilities. It was the sloppiest, most unprofessional thing I have ever done. I broke my own professional code for him. Her head fell into her hands, the sound of her breath catching in her throat, filling the sterile office. I waited until her breathing steadied. This isn't a board appointment, honey. This is a personal guarantee for every cent the Heritage Fund owes. When the Ponzi scheme collapses, and it is collapsing you, as his legal guarantor, are on the hook for the debts. Not just his, but the debt to Marco Maria and every family he lied to. Your future partnership was his insurance policy. You were his human shield, Elena. The full devastating truth of Blake's cruelty hit us both. He didn't just want Elena's support. He wanted her legal shield. He wanted the sterling name backed by Elena's pristine legal license to be the one facing the SEC and the angry investors. He was turning her from a bride into a human sacrifice designed to absorb his legal punishment. He used my trust, my signature, my firm's name. Elena murmured, the shock giving way to cold, crystalline fury. The tears stopped. Her eyes lifted hard and dangerous. The NDA you drafted, he used it to threaten the early investors he couldn't pay out. He told them that if they breathed a word about the fund's difficulties, they would violate the NDA and face legal action from you, attorney Elena Sterling. He used your name to silence my community. He made you complicit. He stole your professional integrity before he stole your family's money. He weaponized your innocence. That was the moment the sheltered corporate lawyer died and the avenging daughter rose. The guilt of her initial silence was now channeled into a cold, legal resolve. She slammed her hand down on the guarantor document, not in despair, but in professional rage. I violated my own ethics, Dad. I cannot allow him to profit from my lapse in judgment. I will dismantle his entire life using the law I swore to uphold. He has the wedding venue booked for Saturday, she stated, her voice steady. The Maritime Museum. They need a final sign-off on the electrical upgrade for their new exhibition hall. Dad, who did the electrical upgrade for the Maritime Museum 2 years ago? I didn't smile. I just looked at my daughter, now ready for war. Sterling and Commerce Elena. We laid every wire, every conduit. We know where the fuses are. I know where the weaknesses are in every building he touches. I know the structural secrets of every place he planned to use. Then we don't call the police yet. We don't tip off the SEC. We control the narrative. We need to ensure that Blake Holland's arrest is not a secret private event. It needs to be a public confession and a community reckoning. I will make sure his inherited privilege is exposed by the earned integrity of the people he wronged. We need to find the weaknesses in his structure, Dad. Not just his fund, but his wedding. His mother is counting on 3 things to salvage their name: the venue, the historical church ceremony, and the final look of the Holland estate. If we can remove those 3 structural pillars, the entire Holland facade collapses right before the ceremony and he'll be trapped. She gripped the desk edge, her breath coming in sharp, determined bursts. We won't just cancel his wedding, Dad. We will turn his day of triumph into his day of professional execution. Toi se tiep tuk viet van ping dance kwa kich bantap trung vau viek vik tuk hien kach quoch goi hui, bojia gm ko tin chien luok chair targets vabat jau kich huat John Bay Quinn Luke kwa min jam bao jat muts tu jankam ke. Fan 510. The demolition man's permits activated. Blake Holland thought his inherited privilege gave him immunity. He thought my trade was dirt and sweat. He didn't realize my business was leverage and relationships. Over 30 years, I'd built the infrastructure of Westchester County, not just the buildings. My hands, scarred from years of honest work, held the secret blueprints to half the venues in the tri-state area. Now I was the demolition man, and I held all the permits, signed not by the city, but by decades of trust. Elena and I finalized the strategy that evening. We wouldn't just cancel one venue. We would dismantle every structural component of the wedding that relied on Blake's optics and the illusion of old money stability. Our targets were specific, chosen for maximum chaos and minimal legal fallout for Sterling & Co.'s. Target 1, the Maritime Museum, the venue. I called the director a kind woman named Mrs. Peterson. Sterling & Cobers had restored their historic dock after a hurricane, saving them millions. She owed me her professional reputation. "Mrs. Peterson?" I said, my voice sympathetic. "This is Vic Sterling. I'm calling about the Holland Sterling wedding. We had our electrical foreman, Tony Ritchie, look over the final sign-off for the new exhibition hall. Tony reported serious non-compliant issues with the HVAC tie-in. If you host 150 people with that faulty wiring, the insurance liability will be catastrophic. I must pull my structural guarantee immediately. I am not gambling with the safety of your guests or your building's insurance." Mrs. Peterson panicked. A liability issue from their most trusted contractor, unthinkable. "Vic, no, we can't cancel a wedding 48 hours out. We will be ruined. Can't you just sign off, just for one night?" "I am not canceling your wedding, Mrs. Peterson. I am protecting your museum's future. I will have my crew there Sunday to fix it free of charge. But you must declare an immediate, uninsurable structural closure for all large events on Saturday. You know I wouldn't do this if the risk wasn't absolute. A collapse is a collapse, whether structural or financial." The Maritime Museum was out? Blake's initial shockwave of panic must have been seismic. Target 2, St. Jude's Historic Church, the ceremony. This was the old money ceremony spot where generations of Hollands had married. Sterling & Co.'s had maintained the church's ancient bell tower and repaired the roof. I called Father Michael, the parish priest. "Father, it's Vic. I need to talk about the structural reports from our last roof inspection. The bell tower's mortar is compromised. If you ring those bells for the Holland wedding, the vibration could cause a structural integrity failure in the adjacent wall. I am issuing a formal immediate closure order for the sanctuary's east wing. Mi smo graditelji, we are the builder's father. We build things to last, and I cannot allow the word of Sterling to be tied to a disaster. Please honor the integrity of the building." Father Michael, a man who feared God and lawsuits, equally agreed instantly. The ceremony was confined to the small, unglamorous side chapel. Blake's grandeur was diminishing hour by hour. The pomp and ceremony, the very thing his mother cherished, were being stripped away. Target 3, the Holland family estate. The backup venue. Blake's mother, sensing disaster, was trying to pivot the entire reception back to their ancestral estate. This was my most personal target where I had been insulted. I didn't call the Hollands. I called the local building code enforcement officer, Joe, a man I'd shared many cups of coffee with and whose son I'd hired as a summer intern. "Joe, that old septic system installation at the Holland estate is non-compliant with the new 2024 code for events over 50 people. If they host a 150-person wedding, you have a public health hazard on your hands. I have the original blueprints. They never filed the correct upgrade permit. You know what needs to be done, Joe. The code is the code. No one is above it, not even 4 generations of Holland money." Within the hour, the estate received a formal cease and desist order from the town. Target 3 demolished. Target 4, the elite florist. The aesthetics. Blake had hired a renowned, expensive florist whose contract was so large she was stretching her small business's cash flow to finance the massive order. My company was a major client of the florist's landlord. I made one call. The florist's contract with the Holland family was immediately voided due to unforeseen supply chain disruptions. The beautiful flowers, the final symbol of Blake's refined world, would never materialize. The wedding would smell like desperation, not roses. By sundown, Blake Holland's perfect high society wedding was reduced to a small, unadorned side chapel and a frantic search for a catering hall. He had tried to erase my heritage. I had erased his social standing. The score wasn't settled, but the foundation was cracked. I sat back in my chair. The final phase was now in motion. I knew Blake would be panicking, but his worst nightmare me had yet to call him back. I waited. I wanted the sound of desperation in his voice when he finally broke. I sat back in my chair. The final phase was now in motion. I knew Blake would be panicking, but his worst nightmare me had yet to call him back. I waited. I wanted the sound of desperation in his voice when he finally broke. The phone screen lit up with Blake Holland's name. I let it ring 4 times, visualizing his panic, before answering with a calm, deliberate click. My heart was steady. My mind sharp. This was no longer emotional revenge. It was a business transaction where his pride was the collateral. Vic, what the hell is going on? His voice was high-pitched, stripped of the smooth arrogance I'd grown to hate. It was the sound of inherited privilege facing a foreclosure notice. The church is restricted. The museum is closed. The florist voided the contract. My mother is hysterical, Vic. She's having her doctor check her blood pressure. Who the hell are you to do this? This is illegal. You are interfering with my life. I'm Victor Sterling Blake. I replied, my voice low and steady. I'm the man who builds the places you think you own, and I'm protecting my interests. You wanted a structural building, but you built a facade with no foundation, and facades collapse. I'm simply enforcing the code you tried to ignore. This is retaliation. Because I asked you to cut your friends? I apologize. I'll put them all back. I'll put them at the head table. I'll personally apologize to every single one of your European peasantry. Just call off your thugs at the building code office, you blue-collar bastard. The insult still surfaced even in desperation. The only thug here is the man who steals retirement money from widows like Maria Kovac. You wanted to remove my peasantry from your wedding? I removed the structural stability from yours. You broke the code of trust, Blake, and I'm the one who enforces the building code. Your apology is 3 days too late and $2.5 million short. He screamed into the phone, the noise cracking the perfect illusion of his Manhattan upbringing. My father is a lawyer. Vic, the Holland name will bury you. You have committed malicious interference. I will sue you for everything you own, down to that ridiculous plaque in your office. We will tie you up in court for the rest of your pathetic immigrant life. You can try, but before you sue the contractor, you should check your own paperwork, specifically that guarantor agreement with my daughter. You didn't just break the code of honor, you committed fraud against an officer of the court. The judge will be very interested in how you used an NDA to silence the victims of your scheme. The law is coming for you, Blake. And I paved the road. The call switched abruptly. The frantic voice on the other end was Mrs. Holland. Her voice was sharp-cutting and trembling, the sound of old money discovering its credit limit. Victor, you call off this insanity immediately. My husband is calling Senator Hughes. You are an immigrant contractor. You don't fight the Holland family. You risk everything. We will ensure your firm loses every permit, every contract. Mrs. Holland, I risked everything 30 years ago when I landed here with $20. I don't fear loss, but you should fear truth. Your son's wedding fund is made of money stolen from my community. You are desperately trying to marry your son into stability to save the Holland name, but the name is already rotten. The marble you crave is a lie. Your son is a Ponzi thief, and you are enabling organized crime. He made a financial error. We will settle it Monday. We will settle it with your daughter. She is a lawyer. She understands these delicate situations. She pleaded abandoning all pretense of social superiority. You made my daughter his legal target, Mrs. Holland. You allowed him to turn her into his human shield. You taught him that old money meant he could violate the trust of hard-working people. Your lesson ends tomorrow. Tell Blake I expect him at the only venue he could secure the cultural hall in Astoria. Mismo graditelji, Mrs. Holland. We are the builders, and we are here to oversee the final demolition. I hung up, the sharp, satisfying sound echoing in the stillness of my office. Blake Holland was trapped. He was frantic, his carefully constructed social world reduced to renting the only place left that would take him last minute. The Croatian American Cultural Hall in Astoria, Queens, the heart of the community he despised. He thought he was coming to a wedding. He was coming to a federal sentencing hearing. It was the night before the wedding. My office was now operating as the war room for justice. Blake thought he was marrying into the Sterling legacy. He was walking into a legal trap. The window was dark, reflecting the stern faces gathered around my large oak table. Elena, now wearing her professional armor, sat across from me. She had spent the evening securing a restraining order on Blake's assets, ensuring that even if he fled, his victims would have a chance at recovery. "Dad, we need a final run-through," she said, her voice clear and precise, lacking any hint of her earlier fragility. "We are using the wedding as a public witness. This isn't just about arresting him. It's about giving the victims a voice in front of the people who protected him, his old money enablers who always looked the other way. This is for Maria and Marco." I looked at the others gathered: Auntie Novak, the forensic accountant, who provided the structural flaw analysis; Miro Peric, a trusted family lawyer with ties to the U.S. Attorney's Office; and Marko Stankovic, the lead victim. "Marco, are you sure about this?" I asked. "You will be standing in front of senators and judges who are Blake's family friends. You have the right to file anonymously. No one would blame you for avoiding this public circus." Marco stood up, his posture straight like the old country general he once was. The shame in his eyes had been replaced by firm resolve. "Vic, I came to this country with nothing, but I had my word. Blake Holland stole the pride of my community. He called us peasantry. I will stand there next to your daughter and tell them what a Croatian peasant earns and what a Holland aristocrat steals. We do not hide shame. We confront it. My silence protected him once. My voice will bury him now. My wife, God rest her soul, she would be proud to know I stood up for our heritage. I owe it to the others who were too afraid to speak." This was the core of our strategy: moral authority. Blake relied on his inherited name. We would rely on the earned integrity of the victims. Elena handed me a thick folder containing the full list of victims, their ages, and the amount Blake stole. We needed the facts to be irrefutable. Elena explained her final plan. "Tomorrow when Blake arrives, the FBI will be positioned nearby disguised as catering staff and venue security. They will not move until I give the legal trigger. I will use the guarantor agreement and the NDA to frame my public statement. I will not just say he is a criminal. I will say he committed fraud against me, an officer of the court. Using a legal document he coerced me into signing. This makes his crime an attack on the rule of law, not just a financial error, and protects my license." I pulled out the small digital recorder. "And what about the final proof? The structural failure of his character?" "The recording," Elena confirmed. "The part where he called your friends European peasantry and told you to sell your plaque. When you play that, Dad, you take away his last shield, his pretense of class and decorum. That recording proves his malice, not just his desperation. It proves he hated the very people whose money he was desperate to steal." Miro, the lawyer, handed me a sealed envelope. "I have notified the U.S. Attorney's Office of the exact time and location of the public exposure. They have authorized an immediate public arrest based on the severity of the Ponzi scheme and the risk of flight. Vic, the second you play that recording, you are giving the signal. The clock stops when the arrogance is exposed." The plan was set. It was ruthless, strategic, and controlled. It wasn't just revenge. It was the meticulous construction of justice. We were setting the foundation for Blake Holland's permanent collapse. I looked at my watch. 24 hours until the reception. I took the Dalmatia masonry plaque off the wall, placed it gently in a velvet bag, and tucked it into my briefcase next to the recorder. I wasn't selling my past. I was bringing it to the wedding to stand witness to the end of Blake Holland's future. Saturday, 4:00 p.m. The scene was the Croatian-American Cultural Hall in Astoria, Queens, a place of honest work, family banquets, and simple dignity. Blake's mother, Mrs. Holland, had managed to rent it at the last minute, a final desperate attempt to save face after the 3 venues I destroyed. The irony was palpable. The family who sneered at our heritage was forced to host their disaster in the heart of it. 150 guests had arrived, the old money crowd looking uncomfortable on the folding chairs. Senator Hughes sipping wine nervously. Mrs. Holland brittle and furious, and Chanel trying to project a veneer of control. And in the corner, my people Marco Maria, Father Joseph, the victims. They were dressed modestly, but carried a quiet, powerful dignity. The room went silent as Elena made her entrance. She didn't walk down an aisle. She walked through the main doors wearing the $20,000 gown Blake had chosen, but without the veil. Her posture was straight, her expression was marble. She was not a bride. She was a prosecuting attorney entering the courtroom. She walked past her mother-in-law-to-be, past the senator, and stopped at a small stage next to a podium, where I had set up the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena's voice rang out clear and steady, amplified by the hall's modest speaker system. "Thank you all for coming. The wedding ceremony has been canceled. This gathering is now a declaration of truth." The murmuring stopped. Mrs. Holland stood up, her face a mask of outrage. "Elena, what is the meaning of this? You are hysterical. The press will be here soon enough." Mrs. Holland, Elena, cut in her voice cold. "I stand here today, not as a bride, but as an attorney and as the daughter of Victor Sterling. I am here to discuss the true cost of Blake Holland's inherited privilege." Blake burst through the side door. He'd been delayed, likely trying to secure an emergency line of credit. He was sweating, his custom suit wrinkled. He was followed by a lawyer I didn't recognize. A cheap suit likely hired an hour ago. "Elena, stop this madness. This is a violation of the marriage contract," Blake shouted, trying to rush the stage. Elena didn't flinch. She maintained direct eye contact, delivering her words with the precision of a legal mandate. "Blake Holland, you stand accused of multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and operating an illegal Ponzi scheme that specifically targeted the elderly and vulnerable in the tri-state area. You coerced me, an officer of the court, into signing a personal guarantor agreement, making me responsible for the $2.3 million you stole." The effect was instantaneous. Mrs. Holland collapsed back into her chair. Senator Hughes was checking his phone, preparing his escape. The old money guests looked at Blake not with sympathy, but with sudden icy social exclusion. The silence felt like the judgment of history. Elena turned to the corner where my friend stood. "These people," she said, her voice filled with quiet passion, "these are the families Blake Holland called European peasantry. Mr. Marko Stankovic, who invested his life savings. Mrs. Maria Kovac, who lost her home renovation fund. They are not peasants, Blake. They are the honest foundation of this community, and they are here to witness your justice." Blake lunged forward, desperation replacing arrogance. "They can't prove a thing. It was a misunderstanding. This is character assassination. You are listening to a jealous immigrant contractor, not a lawyer." I stepped up to the podium, opening my briefcase. "Wrong, Blake. They can prove everything. But the worst thing you stole wasn't their money. It was their dignity. You forgot the first rule of the code. Never insult the man who knows where your moral weaknesses are buried." I pulled the digital recorder from the briefcase, my thumb hovering over the play button. The recording contained the full, arrogant insult. Blake's eyes went wide. He knew that recording would not just sink his fund, but utterly destroy the Holland name forever. My finger hit the play button. The voice that filled the modest hall was Blake Holland's, arrogant, polished, and utterly contemptuous. Blake Holland recording, The list you provided, it's a bit too ethnic. Honestly, they're just European peasantry. The noise level in the hall was immediately replaced by a silence so thick it was deafening. The guests, the senators, the judges, the partners from Blake's father's firm all turned to Mrs. Holland, their faces a mix of disgust and social horror. This was the explicit proof of malice, the final structural collapse of the Holland social code. Blake lunged at the podium, trying to snatch the recorder. "You son of a bitch, I'll ruin you. You'll never build another building in this state." I pushed him back. "You talk about ruin. You stole the life savings of a widow trying to fix her roof. Blake, you tried to turn my daughter into your legal shield. Which one of us is the demolition man, and which one is the criminal? Your legacy is fraud. Mine is structure. The marble you crave is a lie. The true cost of your legacy is the trust you betrayed." The modest double doors at the back of the hall burst open. Two figures in dark suits walked in, followed by four others moving with quiet professional authority. They weren't caterers. Blake Holland, the lead man, a tall, serious FBI agent, announced, "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and organized crime under the U.S. Attorney's mandate. You have the right to remain silent." The ensuing chaos was structural. Blake's cheap lawyer stammered about bail. Mrs. Holland shrieked, collapsing into the arms of a cousin. Senator Hughes bolted for the exit, not wanting to be photographed near the scene. I looked at the departing senator and the judge. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice booming through the sound system, "you are leaving your friend to face his justice alone. You are proving today that old money loyalty only extends until the FBI badge appears. Please take a long, hard look at the man you protected. He is the cancer on your community, not mine. The foundation of your privilege is just as weak as his ethics." As the agents moved to cuff Blake, I pulled the velvet bag from my briefcase. I took out the Dalmatia masonry plaque and held it up. "Blake, you wanted this sold. You wanted the symbol of my honest work gone." I set the plaque down on the podium. "This plaque is worth more than your entire name, because it represents what is earned, not what is stolen. You wanted important people at your wedding. You have them now. These agents, these victims. These are the people who truly matter to justice." The FBI agent cuffed Blake, who was now weeping, no longer arrogant, just a desperate thief. As they let him out, I watched Mrs. Holland. She was completely alone, abandoned by her important friends, her social power vaporized. The defeat wasn't just in the arrest, it was in the total social isolation. Elena walked over to her, not with cruelty, but with finality. "Mrs. Holland, Blake's actions are his own, but I will be using my legal knowledge to ensure that every single cent stolen from these families is recovered. You may try to protect your family name, but I will be protecting the victims. My shame is over. Yours is just beginning. Your inherited dignity died with his arrest." Mrs. Holland just stared, unable to articulate a word, her inherited privilege failing her completely. I looked at my daughter. She was standing tall next to Marco and Maria, her white gown now a symbol of purity and justice, not naive love. The old money facade had crumbled, and the structural integrity of the immigrant community had held firm. The reception was ruined, but the guests that mattered, my community, remained. They didn't leave. They stayed to share food and comfort. The wedding was over, but the sterling heritage had just begun. Blake Holland's arrest was the lead story that Sunday. Not just a local crime, but a national scandal. Old money Ponzi scammer arrested at wedding, betrayed fiancé, was his legal guarantor. The narrative was perfect, the collapse of inherited privilege at the hands of earned integrity. 3 months later, Blake was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, primarily due to the overwhelming evidence of the targeted Ponzi scheme and Elena's testimony about the coerced guarantor agreement. The Holland name was finished. The aftermath was about rebuilding. I found Elena in my old office. The plaque Dalmatia Masonry 1995 was back on the wall, polished and secured. They offered me an expedited partnership, Dad, she said, holding a resignation letter from her prestigious law firm. They wanted me to spin this as a personal moral victory. They didn't understand. They still don't. They wanted me to use my fame for mergers and acquisitions. They wanted more marble. What don't they understand, honey? That I don't want to build a career on litigation. I want to build a legacy on truth. Blake made me a lawyer who almost became a criminal's shield. I want to be a lawyer who builds community. I want to build a place where a man like Marco, who invested in hope, is protected by law. My law degree is now a tool for the oppressed, not a badge for the elite. She slid a proposal across the desk. It wasn't for a new building. It was for the Sterling Heritage Fund. I'm resigning, Dad. I want to use my legal expertise to run this fund, not just to recoup Marco's money, but to offer pro bono legal counsel to our community. For the seniors, the small business owners, the people who Blake targeted. We'll protect their future. We'll be the structural steel they need. We will ensure that the trust Blake stole is replaced by justice we earned. That was the moment I knew my daughter was home. She wasn't just joining the family business. She was defining its moral future. She had traded the marble floor for the mortar. Elena, I said, my voice thick with pride, you don't need my company. You need your own foundation. Let's do it. We'll build the Heritage Fund like we build a skyscraper with precision, honesty, and the best structural integrity possible. Today, Elena is the director of the Sterling Heritage Fund. Her first successful case was securing the full retirement funds for Marco and Maria. She didn't use fear, she used the law. She's now working with the City Council to offer affordable legal services and financial literacy to immigrant communities across the tri-state area. The best revenge wasn't seeing Blake in handcuffs. It was seeing my daughter thrive outside the shadow of his arrogance, using her power to defend the people he despised. We never sold the Dalmatia Masonry plaque. We installed a new one right beneath it. It reads, Sterling & Co. Structural Integrity, EST 1995. As for me, I'm still Vic the contractor. But now when the old money of Greenwich sees me, they don't see an unimportant immigrant. They see the man who exposed their rot, the man who held the power to demolish their entire social structure. The greatest legacy you can build is trust, and the greatest power is earned, not inherited.